author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we answer in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
He's in court. He coming this afternoon. Yes, it's a friend of mine. Senate is in session.
Minutes, sir.
Minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, February 24th, 2021, to be confirmed.
President, I beg that the minutes of the meeting of Wednesday, the February 24th, 2021 be confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting on Wednesday, February 24th, 2021 be confirmed. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Minutes stand confirmed.
Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
I have excuses for absence. First of all, apologies from Senator Julian Hunt and Senator Lucille Moore, neither of whom are able to make it today. I have notifications of late arrival from His Honor the Deputy President, Senator Greenidge, from Senators Kevin Boyce, Senator Kia McConney, and Senator Rawdon Adams.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents. The annual report and audited financial statement of the Barbados Accreditation Council for the financial year April the 1st, 2016 to March the 31st, 2017. The annual report and audited financial statement of the Barbados Accreditation Council for the financial year April the 1st, 2017 to March the 31st, 2018. The audited financial statement of the Barbados Accreditation Council for the financial year April the 1st, 2018 to March the 31st, 2019. Barbados Non-Reimbursable Technical Corporation number ATN/JF 18339/BA, improving institutional frameworks for integrated coastal zone management, national risk information planning systems, and sustainable climate resilient coastal infrastructure. A non-reimbursable financing agreement number GRT/ER 17578/BA between the Government of Barbados and the Inter-American Development Bank acting as administrator of a European Union specific contribution sustainable energy investment program, Smart Fund 2. A loan contract number BA 004 between the Government of Barbados and the Inter-American Development Bank, contingent loan for natural disaster emergencies. The Public Services Qualifications Amendment Order 2021. And finally, the loan agreement between the Government of Barbados and CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, support program for the emergency generated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate, moved by a minister.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 45.2 and 22.1.
The question is that those standing orders so mentioned be suspended for the remainder of this sitting. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Introduction of bills.
President, I beg to give notice of the Appropriation Bill 2021.
First reading.
Mr. President, I want to move the first reading of the Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Amendment Bill 2021. The first reading, I want to move the first reading of the Anti-Corruption and Anti-Terrorism Agency Bill 2021, and to move the first reading of the Appropriation Bill 2021.
The question is that those bills so mentioned be read the first time. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 6. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2021.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Walker.
Mr. President, I rise this morning to move and to speak on the Appropriation Bill 2021. At a most difficult time across the globe, and of course, Barbados is included. If there was ever a time when the significance of the Appropriation Bill was relevant, it has to be at this time. For years, Mr. President, we've had the Appropriation Bill debated with the accompanying document called the Estimates, which speaks to the proposed revenue expenditure, etc., for government to carry out its programs. And it is titled the Estimates, and I believe this is quite apt in a time of COVID-19. If there was ever a time when this should be called the Estimates, it is at this point in time. And I say so, Mr. President, I'm not here to create words, I'm not a lexicographer, but perhaps the honorable member across his side is one. But I say so at a time when we are facing globally this extreme socio-economic decline with their consequences for millions of persons across the globe. Millions have died, persons have been afflicted with the pandemic, and indeed in terms of socio-economic dislocation, I don't know that we can really describe the severity and the intensity of the problem and the suffering that this dreaded scourge has brought upon the earth. And now, Mr. President, a year we've been in this. I distinctly remember speaking in here last March when we were at the beginning, and so we thought of this pandemic. And now here we are 12 months later, and there's still that uncertainty. Countries, and now some countries are into their third phase. We are into our second, or coming out of our second, hopefully. Countries are into their third, and indeed some countries are even speculating that there might be a fourth spike. And so the whole situation is variable, and I'm sure that last year, towards the end of last year, coming up September, October, there was a measure of comfort in Barbados. And we were comfortable, some of us relaxed in terms of the whole adhering to the protocols. And then there was a second spike. And we are dealing with that. And of course, every time there's a spike, it affects our economy, because we went through the process last year. I believe we shut down on the 28th of March or thereabout. and for 4 weeks initially, and that had dire consequences to the economy. I believe when we discussed it in cabinet, it was as though when you thought of revenue, it was unbelievable. 4 weeks of a shutdown in terms of government needing revenue to function, and seeing what really happened in real life terms as support in terms of your collection of revenue, which of course was projected in last year's estimates as to what would be our revenue. Now and obviously there was additional expenditure that we had not planned for. There was the outfitting of Harrison's Point at millions of dollars. There was a matter of the provision, outfitting of the lab equipment, and I'll come to some of these things later. So it just kept going. So you're having reduction in revenue, you're having increased expenditure, and I think we all could assume what would happen at the end of the year to the estimates that were presented and laid in here last year. Mr. President, but now there's another dimension added to all of this. And we have the issues of supply chains and all of that. And now there is the vaccine. And this I aptly describe as the new oil, the new petroleum, because of the amount of bartering and discussions about procurement and getting vaccines. And that further complicates the issue, because it is important. We absolutely will need vaccines, but obviously there will be a cost. And if the conditions continue, one is never certain of the cost of the vaccines that you're going to acquire. I believe the COVAX facility through WHO and PAHO have agreed for especially developing countries and middle-income countries like ours to provide and to make vaccines available at reasonable prices. But they provide also a limited quantities of those vaccines, and I believe their provisions are only for about 15 to 20% of your population. So when we are speaking in terms of getting an economy started and speaking of having a herd immunity and speaking of 70 and 75% immunity, we know that we cannot depend on the COVAX facility to provide the vaccines that we need. And all of these add to the mixture, to the morass in terms of coming together and actually preparing estimates in a pandemic. But, Mr. President, I think we need to set the context. And for the benefit of my good friends on the other side, my good honorable friends on the other honorable side, I think we all agree that the new government was doing well up until February, March last year. I think there's no discussion, there's no querying that, I think, and they've said so, Mr. President. Right. Over the course of the year, they've said so. Right. They've said so. They've said so, Mr. President. Not many other members laughed. You mean the laughter could not control. He can only net with laughter. Punish it with laughter. We had the BERT program in place, whatever he calls it, Mr. President, the honorable member. There was stabilization of our economy. We were looking at growth, as the honorable member is always speaking about, that there is need for growth in our economy. And we were forecasting growth. And of course, the whole process of economic transformation, which is discussed over and over in here. Public debt, in spite of all the discussions, was stable and sustainable path. And as far as we were concerned, we were on this path to 60% of GDP by 2023. Indeed, at the end of February last year, we recorded a primary surplus of 5.7. And we were well on the path to the 6% that we had put as our target. And then it all happened in March. But in spite of that, foreign reserves that stood at about 400 million in June 2018, were over $2 billion for most of last year and indeed presently. And this has provided a cushion, Mr. President, for us to survive this past 13 months, no doubt about it. If those measures had not been taken in 2018, 2019, I guess we can all wonder what would become of Barbados. How would we have managed this crisis? And I think just to think about it, it gave us that cushion to cushion the impact of the borrowing that was necessary and indeed the spending that became necessary. Mr. President, up to that time, our credit rating had improved tremendously. But we did all of this and made all of these achievements while still helping Barbadians. And this was before COVID, the pandemic, and certainly during the pandemic. And I will highlight all of that to give the entire process some context. At that time, while we were stabilizing the economy, we provided a 5% wage increase to public servants. We reintroduced the payment of tuition fees at the University of the West Indies. We indeed increased the minimum non-contributory and minimum contributory pensions in that time. There was a matter of trust loans to young people and young entrepreneurs. We disbursed over 20 million up to the end of March last year. Indeed, in the Ministry of Youth, there was the block, I believe it was the Building Blocks program, and the whole idea of blockpreneurs, trying to train these people on the blocks, provide them with facilities, helping them to develop into small business persons. The Household Mitigation Unit was established to assist persons, especially those who have been displaced from their jobs, to assist them in that time. Mr. President, we often hear of agriculture being neglected. During that time, we established the FEED program, the Farmers Empowerment and Enfranchisement Drive, and over 200 acres of land were allocated to just over 100 farmers. They recorded 315,000 kilograms of produce in that period. So, Mr. President, these were the things that were happening. But there was more, certainly for the middle classes and the poor persons. The qualification level for the reverse tax credit moved from $18,000 a year to $25,000 a year. And those persons were then entitled to just over $2,000 a month. We reduced the income tax. And we changed the bands completely, and obviously the tax bands were adjusted so that persons who were working up to $35,000 a year were more or less excluded from the tax bands. And certainly for the higher levels, like the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, his bracket being his level of commercial activity as a sometimes attorney and a sometimes trade unionist, he would have been at the 50,000 and more, and he would have qualified for a reduction in his tax paid. And indeed, in January last year, we went further and reduced the percentage that he would have had to pay in his income over 50,000 to 28.5%. And Mr. President, we didn't stop there. We provided $11 million to train young people across this country in various social programs and social activities. We helped them before the COVID. And then COVID came last year. As I said earlier, there was a shutdown. Persons were displaced. The economy crashed. Tourism came to almost nil. And we recognized as a government that we had to look after our people. We had to look after the vulnerable. We had to look after those who were being displaced. We had to look after the small and medium enterprises. We had to look after the hoteliers. We had to look after, you describe it, every category, Mr. President. And this was in the face of the pandemic. We started a household survival program of $600 a month for families who had no persons in the household employed. Through this, we helped over 1,500 vulnerable families where no one was employed. We provided a 40% increase in all the welfare rates and fees that they were paying to to individuals. Persons like self-employed nail technicians and other persons involved in hairdressing, etc., who paid NIS but were not allowed to claim unemployment, were given $1,000 while we were on lockdown. Indeed, government reached out to the Barbados Water Authority and persuaded them not to do disconnections for persons in arrears during the lockdown period as people were unemployed. And I heard my honorable colleague on the other side praising that and speaking about some persons in Rock Hall who had benefited from that, not having their water disconnected.
And then you woke up.
Persons who were laid off, we had the issues in terms of the insurable earnings and the NIS, and we're all aware of the efforts of the NIS and the loads that were on the NIS, but in the end, people received their payments. Mr. President, the government went further for employers who were prepared to retain 3/4 of their workforce, even if someone is short week. The government decided that they could defer their obligations to pay the employer's contribution for 3 months in the first instance to encourage them to provide. All of this aimed at trying to maintain people where they could be maintained in employment, but at least in terms of ensuring that they had some income, some means of income. The banks were encouraged, the commercial banks, to utilize a payment moratorium on existing loans, and I believe that the individual banking entities did this on an individual basis. That this was something that the government had initiated. The government recapitalized the Small Hotel Investment Fund with 20 million to allow small hotels to borrow and blend it with commercial funds. Even the artists were able to benefit, and we know in these times they suffered tremendously. And government took funds from the Arts and Sports Development Fund to finance a program dedicated to assisting artists, dancers, and musicians. All of this to assist with the process. And of course, there was the BOSS program. And later on, there was the BESS, which I believe my colleague on the other side has referred to as several other terms or acronyms. But I won't get into that this morning. But all of these things were done, Mr. President, while this government in this little country was battling with COVID-19 and providing for persons in Barbados a level of care for those who were afflicted by the disease that was, I believe, comparable, and even in some cases better than that was available in first world countries. We were here preparing Harrison's Point, that I believe at over $40 million, as an isolation facility. We went further, and we utilized the Blackman Gollop. And then earlier this year, we even went into hotels and utilized them for isolation. In the developed countries of the world, North America, Europe, that wasn't done. I've had friends whose relatives have died at home in the United Kingdom. They were known to have COVID. And the directive was that you stayed at home. Your isolation was where you live. In Barbados, we get all excited when we hear someone might have been exposed. Indeed, we've seen it displayed in here. We've seen the hysteria in this very chamber, where somebody believes that someone might have been close to someone or might have been a tertiary contact. And we feel that they have to be separated. And in the same United States and London and wherever they go, Canada, some of these same people who display this mass hysteria here go to those countries. And if you're positive, you stay home. If you're suspected, you stay home. You're isolating. You're in quarantine, everything in the same space. But in this country, in spite of the economic difficulties, the government embarked on a program to provide the best for Barbadians. Provide the best. Not only that, we recognized early on that there was a need globally in terms of the management of these persons, that there was this issue of ventilators. And of course, the disease, the process is one that we keep learning about it. At the outset, people were dying from this severe respiratory illness and respiratory distress and this special kind of pneumonia, and they were using ventilators. Small countries like ours tried to get ventilators. There was the issue of supply chains, where particularly where you're trying to get ventilators through a third country. And then you hear that there's an order that those ventilators must not leave this country. And that happened to us. Not only ventilators, you name it, monitors, all of these things became in short supply. And you had to pay for them to get them. We have to utilize a number of persons, use private jets. Our airport remained open throughout the process. A number of our supplies that came into this country equipment and supplies came in utilizing private jets. That was one of the reasons why the airports were left open, so that we could get access to supplies and materials and drugs. We even had drugs coming in from India at one stage in terms of getting them here. But these are not the things that we talk about or you publicize every day. These are the things that we deal with internally and solve the problems, because you don't want to put the country into panic. We were concerned when we opened the Harrison's Point that we had this new facility and that we might not have enough ventilators. But there's a God above. And I can report today, Mr. President, that in this country, Barbados, we have more ventilators per capita right now than not any other country in the English-speaking Caribbean. Not one. We have ventilators, Mr. President, that we have not started to use yet. So much of we're getting prepared for this surge. We recognize that in the face of a pandemic, persons are concerned, people are worried. There's this fear of the unknown, and there was a reluctance in some persons, and we felt early on, and the Honorable Senator on the other side, Senator Maynard, can attest to this, that persons were concerned that we might not have enough people, nursing staff or medical staff, to look after persons who were COVID positive. Because again of the fear, and it's an infectious disease. It occurred with HIV/AIDS when people were reluctant to see patients who they suspected might have had it. So it is a normal thing. And we went out and we got a Cuban brigade to come in. They provided 100 nurses here to assist. And they are still here. And they're being involved in all aspects of the care of some of these persons. They're even doing swabbing when we had persons who were scared of doing the swabs for fear that people might cough and they might be exposed. That was an initiative that we took at that point in time, a struggling economy, to do that. Meanwhile, we had Ghanaian nurses coming in to assist with the load at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. There was discussion early on that we should endeavor to ensure that no COVID cases ever reach the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. But Mr. President, you know the reality of the life. I mean, you can't have a tertiary care institution in your main tertiary care hospital institution in a country the size of Barbados, one tertiary care institution, and you have a global pandemic and you expect that you will not get a single case needing to be admitted. When that happened, people started, it's in the hospital. It must be in the hospital. It is a hospital. And we have dealt with that too. We've had to deal with that. There were issues at Harrison's Point, and I believe that we've heard the myriad complaints from time to time. I don't know if any members of this honorable chamber have had the opportunity to go to Harrison. I don't know if we, Mr. President, I don't know. I don't mean if you were positive. Sorry. Mr. President, I apologize. I'm not being intrusive or trying to get into your business. I mean to go to see the facilities. I suspect that my colleague on the other side has been, not as a patient, because I know he has a way, Mr. President, of getting into these things and finding out and seeing what is going on. I've called no name, Mr. President. But I know he has this way of getting into things. You know what? And even it came to the point where we were having difficulty with nurses not wanting to do certain things. And then I saw this honorable friend of mine in the midst of it. In the midst of it. You can imagine? We are dealing with a COVID pandemic in this country. And I'm seeing my honorable friend in the middle of it trying to encourage or discourage nurses from taking industrial action. I don't know which it was, Mr. President, but I don't want to hazard a guess because I might not be telling the truth on it. I would hazard a guess that he was trying to tell them, Mr. President, to go back into work. But I suspect I might not be telling the truth. But this is the sort of situation we were dealing with, Mr. President. This is the sort of situation. But in all of that, we were helping Barbadians. We were helping Barbadians. Mr. President, but it's the appropriation bill. And there, we must speak to the appropriation, to the document. And I'm not going to bore the Honorable Chairman going through the figures because it's all in the document. But just to highlight, and as I said, giving context to the fact that there are variations between what we voted for and what has been the outcome of the year. And the year, in fact, is not yet finished. Today is only the 24th. It was originally estimated that the revenue would be, on a cash basis, would be $3,043.9 million. In fact, what we are seeing now is that, and obviously they're projecting the revenue from March this month, that we are likely to be short of that by over $630 million. So we are looking at, rather than 3.043 billion, we are looking at perhaps about 2.41 billion. And obviously, taxes and on property, they have decreased. Taxes on goods and services have decreased considerably. Decrease in, obviously, in taxes on goods and services, mainly due to decrease in VAT and excise taxes because we are having less commerce, less what is happening. Taxes on income and profits increased, Mr. President. And this was to do with the international financial sector and the one-off paying, the anti-hybrid legislation. That is a one-off thing that we managed to get in this past year. When we looked at expenditure, and I remember I spoke to a number of things that had to be done, we had a steady expenditure of There's 2.52 billion at this point in time. And it is projected that we will end up spending probably 682 million. No, sorry, 75.8 million more than we had approved in this chamber. And there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, I set the tone, in terms of responding to the COVID pandemic. There were a number of supplementaries in terms of goods and services during the course of the year. 8.5 million for government procurement department, and this was to purchase food stores and supplies and personal protective equipment as a result of COVID. The lab, as I said, we had to upgrade and obtain additional equipment and obviously reagents and supplies, $6.2 million. I'm not going to go through all of it. 20 million again to the COVID unit in the Ministry of Health. While we were doing this, we had to spend $2.2 million in maintenance in terms of the prisons. $2 million to National NCC, engagement of 360 workers to do the debushing. As I said, we had to make room for people to allow them to earn a living. When we went back to schools, there was a need for school monitors, persons to ensure and to look at what was happening in the schools, ensuring that children are adhering to the protocols. And this was 4.3 million was allocated for this. There were certain renovations to schools, nursery and primary schools, again, in keeping with making them ready to manage the COVID situation with schools. In addition, there have been current transfers directly from the consolidated funds, and these will increase by over $100 million in this year. And in this amount, these were supplementaries, $10 million provided to the welfare department to meet the additional costs to grants of individuals. I said earlier that we had increased it by 40% to those persons. The household survival program, $10 million there, and $10 million to the Adopt the Family program. Again, this is all towards those families where persons were not employed. The National Assistance Board received a $3.5 million transfer. This is where we introduced the geriatric assistance program, not the home help, but for those people who were living alone and we felt that they might be neglected persons who might need people to run errands for them, to spend some time with them. That was received $3.5 million. BADMC received funds too, and $5.9 million to assist in their project with land lease, etc., recognizing the importance of obtaining food security during the period of COVID. Again, the QH received a transfer of $48.8 million for the management of COVID and a $10.7 million to the QH to assist with current operations at that time. Transport Board received $23.8 million to meet operating costs, and similarly, the National Housing Corporation received $5 million, and $3.5 million went to provide financial relief to vendors, operators of small shops and stalls, and medium-sized businesses. So as I said, a lot of this expenditure was related in some way to the whole issue of the pandemic. When it came to capital expenditure, this also increased by roughly $60 million. So we had to, with the virtual teaching, the vocational training needed to provide tablets and laptops to assist with online classes. $10 million was provided for that. Another $5 million went to the BTII for the upgrade and modernization of Bridgetown. Water Authority, $26.8 million for the Barbados Water Authority for Vineyard Project, recognizing to try to rectify the issues with water supply in the eastern parts of the island. And of course, the Transport Board had a direct transfer for the purchase of buses. So in a nutshell, Mr. President, that is what happened in 2020, 2021. 2021-22, they've made some projections, and I say so projections because, as I said earlier, we are very much still in the face of the pandemic, and the projections and what we plan to do, it's there for this year in the document. And I don't plan to go through all of the figures. I don't want to bore the Honorable Chamber. Suffice it to say that at the current subvention, $120 million is being provided to QH for its operations, in addition to $16 million for COVID, management of COVID issues, and certainly another $22 million is also being provided to the Ministry of Health, again, to deal with COVID issues. Now, Mr. President, the spending obviously affects, and the issues of the COVID pandemic affects the functioning of the various government ministries. And most ministries have been asked to, they would have submitted their initial requests as it is in terms of their budget requirements. And most ministries were asked to make cuts, recognizing the expenditure being incurred as it relates to COVID. Charity begins at home. And of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was able to reduce the provision that it initially wanted. All a part of the process, Mr. President. Mr. President, but before I go there, because I know that there's some honorable members within this chamber that will go to their recurrent mantra about no growth in the economy. I don't mean you, Mr. President, some other members. And that they will speak about the need to diversify the economy and to restructure the economy. I want to say that in this very process, the government has been doing that. We are looking in terms of pushing renewable energy, recognizing the cost of utilizing hydrocarbons continually, and across the island we can see that at work. The issues about food security and that we were not producing and that we were spending too much money importing food stuff. We are addressing that. COVID caused us to address it as it relates to the amount of land that is being brought back into agriculture and the increase in production. And I'll come to that, Mr. President. We looked also at the new trade opportunities, and this is where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs comes in. And I've heard in another place and at another time, the Honorable Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition in the other place, making reference to the need to have new missions and where these new missions are located. And I think all of us would recognize, he included, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade would play an important collaborative role at this point in time in terms of seeking out new markets and new source for goods and services, new sources of possible foreign direct intervention, and that it is very important that there be that collaborative nexus between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade and the ministry and various departments of government. Invest Barbados works collectively with us. And Mr. President, I think you're well aware of the work that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been doing. I mean, you, Mr. President, I mean, your work was, tremendous in Ottawa before you came back home to assume this higher office. You did tremendous work there. And I think you, more than all the others in here, probably understand the importance. Of course, my colleague, Senator Cummins, who played a very important role in terms of trade years ago in the ministry. The importance of the relationship between foreign affairs and foreign trade, especially at this time when Barbados is looking to support, when you want to get your economy going again. We need the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in collaboration, to play that role. Mr. President, the honourable member is making some thing. I don't know, he's trying to blow something. I don't know if it's a balloon he's blowing. But there are no balloons in here, Mr. President. I don't know what he's trying to blow. But needless to say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs focuses on four main pillars. We think at this point that we need to strengthen our traditional bilateral relations, and while pursuing new non-traditional partners. I believe it is the right excellent Earl Barr that said at the time of independence that we were friends of all and satellites of none. I think the time has come now for us to get more friends. We confine our friends to too limited an area, and I think we need to look out further for more friends. Well, of course, remaining not being a satellite of any of them, new or old. We obviously reaffirm the belief in multilateralism, and we adhere to the principles of multilateralism and rules-based. We look to see increasing Barbados's trade levels, and by moving now in the direction of commercial diplomacy. And traditionally, we were not there. Traditionally, foreign service dealt, and I'm not being critical, we were classical. It was a classical relationship. It was political, it was a cocktail party, it was this, it was these days called for small developing countries to get into network diplomacy. We need foreign direct investment. We need opportunities. Mr. President, they criticize the age of someone we send to Canada, he's too old. We send some young people, they criticize them, they're too young. I don't know, Mr. President, I don't know if the COVID in Barbados has affected some of their thinking, and if they never know if they're old or young or what, or in between, but everything is criticized. But you get on with what you have to do, Mr. President. We're ramping up, we recognize the importance of the diaspora, and the honourable member who had a stint in the UK, and we'll come to that later, perhaps Friday, would know the importance of the diaspora. Because I've seen in the newspaper, Mr. President, I don't have it here with me, and on social media, where some, I don't want to, it's not my style, Mr. President, as you know, to be abusive, but it's certainly not my style. No, and to speak about cronyism, and that individual, in spite of wearing a collar, was selected or put as a crony, and nothing else. And the only claim the individual would have had would be to tell people in the United Kingdom while he was a high commissioner that I was born here. And coming to court and being quoted as being an expert on diplomacy. Well, the only thing he did with diplomacy is to write about Earl Walton Barrow. That is the level of his political maturity. And he couldn't even decide what he wanted to do, politician, priest, or diplomat. and has the temerity to speak. Indeed, there are other talents too. But not today, Mr. President. That is not my style. Not my style. So while we continue to focus on deepening and strengthening relationships with the United States, United Kingdom, the European bloc, Canada, we also need to look further afield. We already established in the Caribbean, Latin America, we need to look further afield. And hence the government has made a decision to open new diplomatic missions. Africa, Middle East, at this point in time. We opened one in Panama last January. Well, it's not been officially opened because of the pandemic, but we certainly have an ambassador there and functioning, recognizing the importance of Panama and that whole Central American core, and working with Invest Barbados, where there's interest in the commercial sector from Mexico, Colombia, and Panama. That's what we are doing. In Africa, all of you are familiar. We speak about trade, and some might speak of the cultural links and historical links between Guyana and Barbados. But obviously that is important, but there are other things too. There are cultural and historical links, but there are opportunities in Guyana. And if you've read and been following the news, Mr. President, as I'm sure you do, you'd have seen where the Ghanaian president recently shocked the president in Switzerland when he addressed them and indicated that no longer would Ghanaian cocoa and gold be exported to Switzerland to use to make chocolates and to make watches and stuff like this. So that is the start of thinking, where we must look across, rediscovering our transatlantic destiny. This is time for us to utilize the Atlantic. We're about 6-7 hours away from Accra, as the crow flies. But now we have to travel to New York or London to get there. Those are the sort of things. There are opportunities there, and already there have been expressions of interest between the two countries and business people from both sides. And there have been various memoranda of understanding in various areas that have already been signed. Education, in terms of technical cooperation, in terms of culture. I believe the business chamber has signed an MOU. UE has signed one. And Port Corporation has signed one. Indeed, the port is also looking at one with Port Dubai in United Arab Emirates. So these things are already starting to happen. It's not that we are saying that we're going to establish a mission and we're now going to send out an exploratory visit to see what there is. It has been done. Similarly, in Nairobi, this will serve a dual purpose. That is East Africa. Person there will not only be focused on Nairobi, but be looking at Southern and Eastern Africa in terms of opportunities. There is also the seat of UNEP and UN Habitat. It's the third largest UN agency in the world. The only one, ironically, south of the equator. And we historically believe in South-South cooperation. We also depend on UNEP provided support for a number of projects in this country. I believe your honorable colleague is aware of this, the work of UNEP in this region. And we think it is necessary to be there, to have a face at the table. And that is where we're looking at. And also, memoranda of understanding have been signed. Not as many as with Ghana, but we're certainly looking at the central banks have signed one. Again, this is important in the era of correspondent banking and all of this. There's some very large African banks, and where we depend at this point in time on the North American banks to do whatever they plead literally with us. The time will soon come where we have to look to do our banking in other spheres. So that is important. United Arab Emirates, no doubt the prominence of the UAE in the Gulf, among the Gulf states. They have done projects here already in renewable energy. They have provided grant funding for projects here. And are very interested in the Caribbean and in Barbados. And we see it as an area where we can launch into the Gulf states, which have been doing very well. And hence the decision to place an ambassador there. I must let you know, in terms of Nairobi, the Nairobi office is being provided by the Kenyan government, as a CARICOM office, where they have a large building where they've agreed that CARICOM can set up offices in this building. And that is provided free of cost for a period of time. Similarly, in UAE, they have provided us with office facilities. So it's not that we are going around setting up these large embassies and spending millions of dollars on them. In addition, we are looking, especially in the case of UAE, at the whole role of digital diplomacy. And why do we need to set up a mission with 5 and 6 people? As it exists now, we have missions where we need to begin with, and Minister Cummings, you can bear me out on this. You have to have 2 persons to sign an authorized rep. It can't be an ambassador unless that ambassador comes through the public service. So if you are sending who? Yes. Mr. President, suppose I wanted to send the Honorable Senator Chadsworth Franklin to, let's say, I want to send him to a nice country, Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi Arabia as ambassador. Because he's seen as a political appointee.
He's diplomatic.
And a political appointee, he can go, but I would have to send at least 2 other members from the public service with him, because they have to be appointed and they become authorized reps. In other words, he can't sign anything. He can't sign checks or anything like this. You went through it, Mr. President. That is it. And we need to move from that now. We're into paperless transactions. We need to look at digital diplomacy. Do we really need to have 4 and 5 people in a mission? Can we just establish a mission and utilize the technology? These are things that we're looking at. I mentioned the diaspora, and you would see that in the UK we have embarked on this by establishing a diaspora officer. There is, the honourable member of the opposition spoke about it, the importance of the diaspora as it relates to skills, transfer of information, income, investments, philanthropy. And struggling at this point in time, there are persons who Barbadians who overseas who have a lot that they can contribute to Barbados, both financially and in terms of knowledge and experience. And we believe that this is too valuable an asset to just interact with the diaspora in an intermittent fashion, where you go and you probably have a dinner or you have a function where you do a lecture to them and you interact and you have some fish cakes and sandwiches and blah, 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 till the next time some person comes up to the UK or to London. That we need to involve the diaspora more so in what we are doing. And so we've decided that we will be starting that. We're going to create a diaspora unit within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And we're starting with one initially in the United Kingdom. I believe in Toronto, they already have a fairly substantial organization there. And similarly in the New York, the tri-state area, a lot of work is being done. We are also, of course, maintaining our presence in the Caribbean community, and we've taken a leading role in the Caribbean community. We're pursuing investment and opportunities, both in terms of the Bracopanda Agreement, which is in effect a technical cooperation and cultural cooperation, the Bracopanda with Suriname, which lists a number of areas of cooperation. And we similarly have one with Guyana. And at this point in time, Barbados has fairly good relations with both Suriname and Guyana. And there's a lot of scope as it relates to trade. I see recently that I've seen that Suriname will soon be having airlines operating into Barbados, Paramaribo, Barbados, Curacao, sort of thing, Trinidad and Curacao. And these are the things. The issue there with Suriname has often been the inability to get produce from one country to the next. And we're hoping that this will work out. So we're still pursuing those relations in CARICOM, especially in Southern CARICOM, Trinidad, Suriname, Guyana. China. And I believe when we mention this country's name, people get worried. It gives you all sorts of issues. I've heard recently that we shouldn't even think if the WHO approves the Sinopharm, one of the Chinese vaccines, that we shouldn't think of bringing it here because there might be a reluctance for Barbadians to have a vaccine from China. But Mr. President, you know that everywhere we go in Barbados, we either purchasing, eating, or doing something that is Chinese. So that is another story for another time. I think the reality is that, these things. But more importantly, I signed the agreement in the Belt and Road Initiative in China in 2019, looking specifically at infrastructural development for Barbados. I know we've read all sorts of stories out of Africa about and Asia about Chinese coming in and spending this and lending you money, but that is not what we're about. In Barbados, we've entered into programs with the Chinese, and we pay our way usually. So we are not looking for things to be given to us. We pay our way. Why I'm speaking about China, though, China has done quite well in spite of the global economic issues. And not only China, but a number of countries in Southeastern Asia. And Barbados, for the first time in over 20 years now, has an honorary consul in Tokyo, Japan. Not only an honorary consul, but he's a Barbadian honorary consul. I don't think he went to Commermere, Mr. President. I don't think he went to Commermere. I believe, but he's there. He is in Tokyo. And any times you're there, you should reach out to him. He's very well connected, and he is a Barbadian there. But in addition, we have secured, in terms of our mission in Beijing, that they be accredited to South Korea, to Japan, to Vietnam, to Singapore, to Cambodia, and to Thailand. So the honorable member on the other side can tell his leader that we didn't want to hear him speaking about it 2 days ago. We have already done it. So while the honorable member in the other place who is speaking about Barbados needs to reach out to Cambodia and Vietnam, we are already doing that. We are already doing that. And certainly, Mr. President, when the time comes and the good people of Barbados, decide that they have had enough of us, then the honorable member and his PDP party are free to go in and continue the expansion of our relationship with various countries. I was almost tempted to say with his band of specialists, experts, misfits, and malcontents, but I was only tempted to say that. I don't believe I said it. Mr. President, I'm sorry. It's getting a bit thirsty. So essentially, that's where we are in terms of our direction, working, as I said, continuing the relations that we have with some countries and working on others. Now, the matter of trade. Barbados has been playing over the years a fairly active role at the WTO, and we certainly expect to continue playing that role under the new leadership at the WTO. And our ambassador has been very much involved in the process and actually was invited by Madame Ngozi, who's the new Director General, to go to Nigeria, to Lagos with her when she was going home for her celebratory visit. And it's been quite useful. Apparently he had an audience with the President of Nigeria and all of that. But that is another story for another time. And the matter of the UNCTAD that was to be held here in October, which we were looking forward to hosting. First time it would be held by a small island developing state like ours. And now, because again of vagaries of COVID, it's been postponed twice, and now we're going to do it virtually. This has been agreed. We obviously, in terms of the benefits that we expected to derive from it, related to tourists and persons coming to the country, we're going to lose that. But virtual conference doesn't shut us out. It still gives us prominence, global prominence. And we've been looking at the various fora that were planned as sideline events. And rather than now we were proposing to hold them in schools or the Queen's Park, now going virtually, it gives us a wider audience for those things. In addition, Barbados retains the presidency for 4 years, and indeed in that time should have a leading role in setting the agenda as it relates to small island and middle income countries and dealing with a number of trade issues. So we expect certainly to be still playing a prominent role there. So we expect to, as I said, to be still involved. Mr. President, I mentioned the ministry working with Invest Barbados. And as I said earlier, this is an important nexus, the two entities working together. It is felt right now when we look at the global business sector, that's what they call themselves now, as opposed to international business and international finance. That is estimated that that sector contributes approximately $800 million to Barbados economy annually and provides over 4,000 full-time jobs to Barbadians. So we obviously see this as an area, an important role for Invest Barbados. And we see necessarily that it is important that we market ourselves together. Invest Barbados is looking essentially now, I'm hearing, at 10 sectors. The global business, financial, and insurance services. They're looking at high-value added ICT services. And when we speak of our dependence in tourism, the services economy, we're now looking at offering services in other areas. Niche manufacturing and medical devices as it relates to education and knowledge delivery. And of course, fintech. And medicinal cannabis, research and development, and life sciences. And members would have heard the Honorable Prime Minister speaking about the need to look at biotechnical, looking into biotech. And again, COVID has driven us to this. The variants that are occurring, and that they'll be into the realm of genomics and genetic testing and genomic sequencing. And we have been here before, because Dr. Francis Collins gave a lecture here in Barbados, I believe it was in 2004, 2005, about the DNA and the sequencing of the genes and the role that they play in diseases and whatever, and how we can perhaps use genetics to treat certain diseases. So we're back here 15 years later with COVID. And the decision has been made that we will invest in, first of all, outfitting the Best of Santos lab to be in a position to do the DNA testing, to do the genomic sequencing, and certainly have us in a position within the next few months of being able to check for the various variants of COVID, and to move on over time in a phased process in establishing this life sciences lab in Barbados. So we are looking at these new areas. As I said earlier, Invest Barbados, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is interested in Africa and in Central America, and will continue to do the collaborative work with the Ministry of Health, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Trade. Quickly, Mr. President, Ministry of Health and Wellness, and I know it is extremely very well represented in this chamber, and no doubt we will hear a lot about the Ministry of Health and Wellness, if not even the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. But again, this has been the ministry, one of the ministries to which a large portion of the funds allocated have been assigned to. They have been working assiduously with COVID, and I'm not going to go into details of that. Suffice it to say that they are now working to try and complete the accident and emergency, the extension to the accident and emergency department. I'm told that it should be completed by the middle of this year, but certainly not after the third quarter. Mr. President, so that process is ongoing. In addition, there is a new cardiac services project that has been started, recognizing the number of people in Barbados who suffer heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, and that oftentimes a number of these people, in terms of their prognosis and the extent of the disease, could be halted or assuaged, if they got adequate care in a timely fashion. That is, if you've had a heart attack, you're getting out of classical signs, chest pain, an ambulance comes for you. As it is now, you don't get effective, well, you get supportive care, you might get a drip, get oxygen on the way, but no definitive care in terms of thrombolytics to deal with any clots or whatever that are causing the issue in your heart. And this cardiac services program is meant to improve the efficiency of care of persons who have acute myocardial infarctions, and to implement treatment before they get to the hospital. Indeed, to be able to, for ambulance people to be able to start initiating treatment. And there's expected to have an arrangement with even the private sector, those centers that provide emergency care. And I know that this is one of their flagship projects for this year. As it relates to the Ministry of Health, they're pursuing the refurbishment of outpatient clinics, which have been derelict for quite some years in St. Joseph and in St. Andrew. And these are, I have the photos, Mr. President. I can really display them here. They're quite impressive. The outpatient clinics at St. Joseph and at St. Andrew. Vector control, another one of the issues that they've done some work at St. Philip District Hospital. Extensive refurbishment was done. But I don't know, Mr. President, you're more familiar with Rhonda Phillips. I would figure that the honorable member would be familiar with Eunice Gibson. I don't know what would have him straying up to Rhonda Phillips, unless perhaps he went to see some person who was in police custody or something. Vector control is an area of tremendous interest to the Ministry of Health, and the ministry is embarked on an extensive and expanded mosquito control program, which started in December. They have employed 40 additional persons working in that department. They have acquired both handheld foggers and the ones that you attach to the back of the trucks, recognizing the importance of controlling the mosquitoes. The climate has been good to us because it seems to be started in this year thus far. We seem to be in a drought, and that has assisted considerably. But the intention is to certainly identify these areas where mosquitoes are breeding and to see how we can deal with the dengue fever that seemed to be raising its ugly head in Barbados. Mr. President, the Barbados Tourism Investment Company has a very important role to play in Barbados in developing a number of properties and providing urban rehabilitation programs and having joint ventures with the private sector. The honourable members on the other side would be probably very interested in hearing an update because they've heard about capital projects starting, and I've heard the honourable leader on more than one occasion speaking about these capital projects and when are they going to start and when are they going to end. I start with the Lord's Castle redevelopment. It's a 450-room Wyndham Grand Hotel, and it is now being expected to be completed by the end of this year. It's being financed, of course, by a US $170 million loan from Exim Bank of China. When completed, is expected to employ 1,000 persons, and consistent with government's policy, it will be sold to the private sector because we don't believe that we should be running hotels. So far, I believe it's 308 rooms have been completed. I said 450, and it is expected to be completed by the end of this year. The Hyatt Ziva, a number of these projects, of course, with COVID have been put on hold because the investors have been reviewing the macroeconomic situation, persons not traveling. Hyatt Ziva, it's a 370-room hotel with 26 residences, and it will have 2 towers. All planning permissions have been received except for over-the-water villas. And as I said, the flyer is reviewing the process and looking at it, the impact of the macro environment, and the project is expected to start this year. Massey Pierhead, the 7 acres of land owned by at the Pierhead is being inquired by an investor who plans on building a 250-bed hotel with additional condos and retail space on Bay Street. The investor is not interested in a high-rise or dense development, but in a beautifully family-type hotel with adequate green and blue space. And again, this is not expected to commence this year, with an estimated budget of US $120 million. A Bridge House, the Pierhead, and this was planned to be a hotel, but I gather that the investor wants to do something to support the 2 or 3 hotels in Bridgetown and the cruise ship passengers with some sort of entertainment and retail space. And the upper floors will likely be condos. This is also timed to start this year. Carlisle House, I think all of you are familiar with that at the car park down there. Obviously, the investor here is a Jamaican investor, and they're working with JADA. They're reviewing the business model, but one of the requests is to secure more land to make the project scalable, and of course, parking is also an issue. They were planning to come here last month, but because of the shutdown, they put off that for the time being. And Blue Horizon is waiting town and country planning approval. VITA is also doing projects in Spikestown in flood mitigation, and these started in December last year, and expected that the construction period will finish by February next year. The project had to stop for about a month because of the shutdown that we had, but recommenced on March the 1st. And similarly, the Constitution Flood Mitigation Project Phase 3, this recommenced on March the 1st after initial pause after the lockdown, and is now expected to be completed by the end of March next year. The Golden Square Freedom Park, the construction of the park in the center of Bridgetown, as a tribute to the national hero Clement Payne, is expected now to be completed in the second quarter of this financial year at an estimated cost of $8 million. And there are certain other projects for which there are requests for proposals. So, Mr. President, that was just by information for the benefit of the chamber. Mr. President, I go to the environment and national beautification just to briefly mention some of the important projects that they are doing. They're also responsible, of course, for sanitation, and we don't hear the complaints that we heard about 18 months ago as it related to collection of garbage. And the matter of the SBRC is still being sorted out, the agreement as related to recycling, etc. A botanical gardens project is the one that we've been hearing so much about, and we all see the work that is being done. It is special to be a really beautiful place when it is all completed, and work is progressing on that. There's also the project, the tree planting project, planned to plant at least 1 million trees across Barbados as part of our efforts in reducing our carbon footprint. There's a clean and green project which we've been hearing the minister speaking about, and it's beautifying the country. I mean, sometimes Barbados is really looking quite untidy, the overgrown bush and garbage strewn across the place, and I must say that they are making progress in cleaning Barbados and obviously trying to make it greener. So there is work going on there. Of course, they have the issues to deal with related to climate change, and that ministry is very much involved in the whole issues related to COP and Barbados' role and playing a role as it relates to small island developing countries in the whole arena of climate change and financing of climate change. Mr. President, the Ministry of Transport and Works and Maintenance is a very large one and a very important one. And they have been doing a lot of work and plan to do much more in the coming year. There are a number of projects that they have embarked on. And perhaps I should just overview briefly their Highway 1 upgrade, and as we all know, that is in progress. There's plans to do the Highway 7 from Rendezvous Hill to Independence Square, and this is expected to start in the third quarter of this year. There's a number of IDB Global Roads project, and this is expected to start in July. There's a CAF $3 million road project, and this is also to start later this year. In addition, first we know that they have responsibility for Barbados Water Authority, and a lot of work is planned for this year as it relates to the Barbados Water Authority. The water supply, and I know this is important to several members, the water supply network upgrade project, where they're looking at changing mains and erection of storage tanks and refurbishment of reservoirs. And this process, total cost is $71.6 million. The amount now is to be spent this year is $12.2 million, and the estimated completion of this entire process is now going to be in January next year. There's the Barbados Water Infrastructure Rehabilitation Project funded by the EIB, European Investment Bank, and this is expected to be completed in 2 years. But this year they plan to spend about $10 million in doing some of this. There's another project with the Barbados Water Infrastructure Rehabilitation Fund funded by the CAF, and this also is expected to be completed in 2023, and they expect to spend $7.9 million out of $20 million in this year in doing a number of parts of this project. The St. Stephen's to Lodge Hill upgrade project, which has been spoken about for some time, and that is expected to be completed in 6 months, and $8 million will be provided for that. As I said, the Highway 7 that process is being looked at. So there's a lot of work going on in public works. I'm not going to go into the details of all of the tenantry roads that are being done, but I can highlight that we've spoken for a long time about the Scotland District and the deterioration of the roads in that area. And there are a number of roads, I believe it's over 30 roads to be completed in the Scotland Roads District Road Rehabilitation Project, which is being carried out by the Chinese company Complant at a cost of $225 million estimated cost. So that is ongoing. We all know about the electric buses and the reduction in the cost of diesel. So we know that there is some progress there. Mr. President, I come now to the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, which I spoke to earlier in COVID and the issues of food security, and to report that Mr. President, you said something, Mr. President? I didn't hear anything. At the beginning of the COVID epidemic, pandemic, the whole issue of uncertainty associated with global food chains, and the ministry decided that they needed to urgently put about 685 acres of land into production as rapidly as possible. At the end, they did better than that. The target was surpassed by approximately 73 acres during that first 6 months of the year. When they looked at their production in 2020 with this increased land, they found that the overall crop production increased by approximately 7% over the corresponding period in 2019. Again, out of COVID came good, as we recognize the importance of increasing production in agriculture. And there are very interesting information. Livestock production obviously fell in the period, January to December last year. Chicken, for example, went from 16,231,000 kilograms to 11,964. A percentage change, 26% decline. And this is a direct result of the hotel sector and restaurants and everything being affected during the course of the year. Also showed, interestingly enough, that in Barbados, the banana production, which was 189,000 kilograms in 2019, rose to 1,127,000, increased by 49% in 2020. And similarly, plantain production went from 31,000 to 254,390 kilograms. Again, as a result of us focusing more on agriculture and food security. The Farmers Empowerment and Enfranchisement Drive, which was one of the projects that this ministry spoke about, one of its major projects, where you were taking persons who are interested in being into farming, providing them with land. And I mentioned this earlier, 196 acres was allocated and 121 farmers were placed. And they were involved in a number. 73 went into vegetable crop, 17 into agroforestry, 8 into apiculture. Livestock production was 24. Some did black belly sheep, some did rabbit rearing. 2 did aquaponics, and 3 did vegetable greenhouse and crops and livestock. And this produced about 315,000 kilograms of crops, and it is expected that they yielded about $1.6 million from that project. And this is also being done in 20 acres of land at Bath, St. John, and I believe this was in the social media and in the newspaper recently. The issues at Bath and the dumping that occurred there. But the ministry is also moving ahead with its doing a lot of work in terms of water augmentation. One of the issues with the feed farmers in St. Lucie, it affected the production in spite of the apparent success, was the lack of water at some points in time for them, and this is being addressed. Another issue has to do with the soil management, where over time we've just been plowing the soils and just compacting the lower layers, and we produce what we call deadpan soils, and the roots can't penetrate to get the nutrients. And so they're also looking at this. They're also looking at germplasm security, and as it relates to cassava, yam, sweet potatoes, and for us to develop better varieties, again, to secure our food. The plan, however, going forward now is to expand this, bring the amount of land that is brought back into agriculture. I said that they were able to bring over 700 acres in last year. The plan now is to extend this to a total of 2,000 acres over the course of the next year. They plan to increase it by 470,000 in the first quarter, 545 in the second, 494 and 536 in the other quarters, and to get to an annual amount, as I said, of just over 2,000. I'm hoping to be able to reap 17 million kilograms of products, crops from this land. So this is a very bold venture, but it's one that the Ministry of Agriculture has now embarked on. And they're also looking at the whole issue of value chain development, as where we just don't just export for the sake of exporting. And in this regard, the ministry is now looking at the development of the black belly sheep industry. They're looking at the apiary industry in terms of the possible exploitation of honey. They're looking at the cotton industry. I think there's a revitalization of that. And of course, medicinal cannabis. So, Mr. President, there is quite a lot going on in agriculture. And I just thought that I will just go into some of those ministries for the benefit of my colleagues in the chamber who just for their information as to what exactly is happening in the country in these various areas. Because oftentimes we don't hear much about what is happening. We are more caught up in the social media and the dramatics and lodging cases and coming out of courtrooms and speaking about what is going to happen and testing cases. We mix oftentimes the more important issues and so what is happening. Mr. President, as I said at the outset, an estimate estimates in the middle of a pandemic is one of uncertainty. I have shown how we have been able to manage in these very bleak times, economic times, especially when we've had to do lockdowns. I think we all know it's a matter of balancing the economy, monitoring the figures and the data as it relates to COVID, while trying to balance with our economic activity, recognizing that the country at the end of the day needs to survive, and we need to pay our bills, and we need to get our country going. We have started looking at, and I've explained, looking into issues of the transformation and of the economy. But at this point in time, suffice it to say that we all must be our brother's keeper, and we must endeavor and work assiduously together to ensure that the economy of Barbados is able to survive while we remain safe and adhere to the protocols and try to avoid the hysteria. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Walcott.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time.
Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also want to thank the Leader of Government Business for that extensive presentation because it gives it gives context. And I do agree with him in the middle of a situation that we find ourselves in where there's so much uncertainty all around the globe. We can only estimate at this point where we're going. Sir, but before I start, I want to make a caveat, and that is, I don't know if it is because there is so much going on, particularly as government is preoccupied with COVID, but I have to speak to the number of errors that have been found in these estimates of revenue and expenditure. They start on page 2, Mr. President, where we have, sir, bear with me because I'm really trying to keep on my mask as I speak this afternoon, where we have the projected total capital expenditure being $127.2 million. However, the actual capital expenditure, which is 118.6, and then the projected total capital expenditure, the projected capital expenditure for February and March 2021 is 28.5, and that 118.6 million plus 28.5 do not add up to 127.2. I am not within, the inner circle of the government, but those type of errors are concerning for persons who do not know if it is an immaterial error and it is just an editing error. But nonetheless, sir, I move on and I make that point. And there are other errors as you go through the document, as we've seen too, because a number of amendments have been sent to us regarding these estimates. Sir, as I prepared for this contribution, I thought it was also important to take stock. There is a lot happening at the moment, and sometimes emotions tend to override facts. And I thought it was a useful exercise to cross-reference these estimates of revenue and expenditure with the throne speech that we had on the 15th of September 2020, because government thought it was so important in relation to a change in direction because of COVID to prorogue Parliament and have a new, almost social contract with the people of Barbados in where they intended to go. And so I am one that there are certain phrases, certain words that stick with me. And I quote from the throne speech, it was in order for us to take fresh guard and articulate a new vision. And it was acknowledged, sir, that we have entered into a new era and old things have passed away. And if that is the case, then these estimates should reflect that. Also, given these estimates, context, sir, is the fact that we are still in an IMF Extended Fund Facility program, which more or less has us, although we've relaxed some of our criteria in the program, like our primary surplus, it still ring fences us in relation to what we can do as a country and how we go about doing it. Sir, and as I reviewed the documents, I came to the conclusion that Barbados has somewhat found itself in a deadlock. And a deadlock in the sense that a lot of the efforts that we have put towards moving forward in the past, and possibly in this current dispensation where we find ourselves in a pandemic that is affecting economic activity, we do not mount the requisite level of activity to overcome the external shock that the country faces. And thereby, we find ourselves sometimes in a stagnant position for an extended period of time. So let me fix this mask. So, sir, I'll start by talking about our macroeconomic position. For all intents and purposes, yes, Barbados, the macroeconomic position was improving at a cost. It didn't come free. There are many pensioners and the like that will tell you that they had to bear the brunt of fixing that macroeconomic position at an individual level, where we restructure the debt. But sir, now we find ourselves in a position where we have an increasing fiscal deficit and national debt. And yes, by and large, this is clearly due to the pandemic and the expenditure that we had to incur and the fall in revenue. But sir, what we have to do now is to ensure that we are vigilant, extremely vigilant, that this situation does not turn into us being in what is commonly known as a debt trap. Mr. President, the fiscal deficit for last year is being now reported, or the end of this financial year, 2020-2021, is $1.047 billion. What was originally budgeted at the beginning of the financial year was a deficit of $265 million, a difference of $781 million than anticipated. And sir, we had to therefore rely on external funding sources to make up this shortfall from the IMF, from the IADB, CDB, and the like. This year, the government is expected to run a fiscal deficit of $782 million. And based on the estimates of revenue and expenditure for 2021-2022, it is seeking to get that financing from external sources, $447 million, and non-project based, which is not commercial, $250 million. On the domestic side, government is seeking to finance this deficit by seeking to raise $334 million, of which $292 million will be sourced from financing, which is not debentures, bonds, treasury bills, the usual financial instruments we know that government seeks to implement when they're trying to raise capital. Sir, I have not heard from the government, both on the external side and the domestic side, where this financing is possibly or likely to come from, and also what is the possible cost of this financing. Sir, because the size of the debt that we are incurring is one thing, but the profile is also equally important, because the level of interest that we will possibly be paying for this debt, along with the repayment period, is also equally important. And I think once we are finding ourselves in a position where we're running these types of deficits, it would be prudent that the government also articulates where it intends to get this financing from. So, sir, I quietly sound an alarm that falling into a debt trap, sir, could be possible, because what we are seeing is a ballooning of the fiscal deficit, not necessarily because of increased expenditure, which is interesting, because the difference between what was approved last year and the revised amount for this financial year, is only $147 million. So government, more or less, despite the supplementaries and everything else, has capped their expenditure. Where the issue lies is the fall in government revenue, $633 million less than anticipated. And the problem then lies in, if you have an economy that the economic activity is so severely depressed, there aren't many ways by which you can raise revenue, because anyone would tell you that will just make the situation worse. So when you find yourself in a position like where we are now, where economic activity has declined last year by 18%, it is anticipated to grow by less than 5% this year, and you find yourself running these large deficits and you're constrained fiscally by what you can do, then it leads you to that position where you are financing these deficits through debt. So, sir, I said, I sound a very quiet alarm with regards to where we are and the situation prolonging itself into what we call a debt trap. Sir, the other area I'll talk about is our debt service payments. That is also something that we need to be vigilant on. I've heard from some corners of the government that the debt service payments, it is not a problem, and the like. But sir, our ability to pay back monies which we owe is equally important. If we continue, sir, to run deficits for another 3 years, we may find ourselves with a larger proportion of our current expenditure being taken up by simply just paying debt. And then that could actually crowd out government's ability to spend on other things like social services, et cetera, if it wants to keep the fiscal deficit contained. For the upcoming financial year, sir, our debt service is anticipated to be $817 million, which is around 25% of current expenditure. So already a quarter of our current expenditure is represented by just paying debt. Sir, in another 3 to 4 years, we're also anticipated to be paying back in full yearly amortization and interest on the external debt that we restructured. So that alone will move from $17.1 million at present to $72.5 million yearly. That is almost a $100 million increase. I believe by 2023, 2024 is when we'll start to make those payments. And sir, a lot of that negotiation happened pre-COVID, where we anticipated that by now, or at least by next year, by and large, the Barbadian economy would be growing. So given that we've had this major collapse, more or less, in the economic activity in Barbados, we have to contemplate a scenario, almost a worst-case scenario, where we have a stagnant economy that is not growing, or there's very little growth, and it does not compensate for the loss that we've suffered last year. And how do we reconcile that with the debt payments that we have we are obliged to pay, Mr. President? Sir, it might be all well and good for us to assume that all will be well, but I think in this type of scenario where there's so much uncertainty, there is merit for preparing for the worst, but you hope for the best. We are in a precarious situation where daily the situation with COVID is so, as government likes to call it, fluid. It is so dynamic that you are uncertain of what comes next. And one thing that the leader of government business said just now, I believe he said that we pay our way. And if that is so, then, sir, we have to earn our way out of this economic situation. Sir, if that is the case, if we have to earn our way, then are we then pivoting in a new direction? Are we breaking the deadlocks that have previously existed that have held us back in terms of the potential of economic opportunities? Sir, there were a number of promises. Again, I refer to the throne speech. And in the other place, I was actually pleasantly surprised to hear the number of initiatives, particularly by the Minister of Agriculture. And we were also given some promises as it relates to renewable energy initiatives and the opening of new missions, which the leader of government business just gave us a full expose of why those missions are necessary. But sir, when we take all those things into account, there is still a heavy reliance, particularly at the moment, of tourism returning in order for us to keep afloat. And I am not one that would say that tourism is not important, but sir, what is clear is that we are unsure as to when we will see the level of tourists that we had pre-COVID. Yesterday only, or Monday I believe it was, yes, on Monday, the UK Prime Minister, their parliament spoke about finding individuals who chose to travel for holiday, a $5,000 fine. And if that is the type of environment that we are dealing with as it relates to tourism, it is clearly then, sir, that we have to make haste, yes, to diversify the Barbadian economy, because the situation as it relates to traveling, as it relates to mass gathering, clearly is not going anywhere anytime soon. And the longer we wait to kickstart a lot of these other initiatives, it may be to our own detriment. Sir, as I said, tourism, yes, is important, and it's also important for us to look at where the government has put a lot of money. in this recovery, or at least keeping a lot of these sectors afloat. Under the Barbados Employment and Sustainable Transformation Program, that was actually the single largest allocation of funds at $300 million, particularly targeting the hotel sector. Sir, and despite its best efforts, I believe it has been adapted twice. That's fine. And it is still undergoing review. And even stakeholders in the sector have said that many employers in the industry have not taken up the opportunity to reskill a lot of their workers or upskill their workers. And what is clear is there needs to be more consultation with the sector as it relates to the BEST program. One of the things I found strange when I heard of the program was we were giving companies who had very little activity money to keep workers employed, yet those companies were not generating revenue. But you were still incurring expenses if you open for business, or you have you still have rent to pay, or a lease, a mortgage, all of these things, Mr. President. And how is it then that you're going to run a company where the expenses are racking up, you're keeping employees employed through government financing, you still are going to have an issue? So I always was a bit challenged as to how a lot of these players in the market were going to survive with the level of economic activity being little or zero in some instances, but yet still having that financing coming from government for particular activities. It was always going to be a challenge, sir. Sir, this year, tourism is being allocated $19.8 million, I believe it is, an increase of just about $5.8 million. But then what is interesting is in 2022 to 2023, the expenditure increases by $29.6 million. I stand corrected, those are the numbers that I have. And when I look through the estimates, sir, a large proportion of that was coming from sub-program 0599, the National Tourism Program, where operating expenses moved from $265,000 to $3.6 million. Professional services moved from $443,000 to $3.1 million. Machinery and equipment moving from $648,000 to $3.6 million. And assets under construction from $1.7 to $10 million. I know that I have two colleagues, honorable colleagues here in the chamber who are intimately involved in the tourism sector, and I'm sure that they will give some indication as to what reflects those increases. And I assume it's some type of new project. And my only question there would be, how is that allocation of funds intended to diversify the tourism product? And is it reflective also of the 21st century traveler? Because one of the things we also need to ensure is that the needs of the 21st century traveler, we have to first understand that they're different from that of the 20th century traveler. There are varying things that are happening now in the tourism market that we have to keep abreast and make sure that we are responding to these changes. Sir, in keeping the tourism sector afloat, more or less, there's also the challenge that we may also be creating what some economists call zombie companies. After the 2008 recession, many companies in the United States were bailed out by government, and that assistance was what was keeping them afloat. And they were not engaging in significant economic activity, but they were racking up high levels of debt and were unable to pay even interest payments. And I'm wondering, sir, if there will come a point where we assess the tourism sector in relation to the funds that we're giving them and the assistance in relation to the type of debt that they're holding at the moment, and if we're not creating zombie companies in that sector. Sir, in the US alone, zombie companies represent a total debt load of $1.98 trillion. And many economists are saying that because you are supporting companies that are no longer financially viable, you actually make the economic situation worse and the recessionary effects deepen and are prolonged. So, sir, I just want to know if there is some mechanism in place by which we know at what point does government move away or divert funds away from these older, more mature industries to new emerging industries to ensure that we are supporting economically or financially viable companies in Barbados. One of the things I also want to say is, sir, as it relates to tourism, because I know a lot of people say we want to open, and some people have said, we have to get persons back out to work. And I understand that, Mr. President, I do. But when I look at the tourism product that we have, I was reminded of an assessment done by Dr. Simon Natrum last year. He was then president of the Barbados Economic Society, and he did an assessment called A New Tourism. And he said in that assessment that tourism is an unreliable industry on which to build an entire economy. Even during good years, tourism activity fluctuates enormously during low season. Tourist arrivals are 45% lower than during peak season. And this means that employment in tourism is very volatile. Large number of workers become unemployed or underemployed during the low season. And tourism at present is a highly inequitable industry. So as much as we like to say, we want to return to some level of normalcy, what type of normalcy are we actually accepting if this is the type of industry and how it's characterized? It is characterized by those being unemployed or underemployed during the low season, making the employment volatile, and it is also an inequitable industry. Sir, accommodation and food services from 2009 to 2018, according to Dr. Natrum and the data that he presented, grew by 17%. The rest of the Barbadian economy shrank by 3.5%. You have to ask the question, therefore, if tourism crowds out a lot of the activity that could happen otherwise in the Barbadian economy, given these numbers. Sir, he then goes on to say in this assessment, and he pulls from research done by two academics at UWI Cave Hill, Professor Troy Lord and Dr. Tennyson Joseph, and they state that data collected on hotels for the comparable period in 2017 indicates that hotel ownership in Barbados is very concentrated. There was an estimated 4,728 rooms available in the traditional hotels, and of these, 47% are held by 8 owners. 47% of traditional rooms in Barbados are held or owned by 8 persons. The ownership is predominantly white. Sir, hence my reason why I say, when I review a lot of the information, I feel like we are in a deadlock in some instances. So, therefore, I have to ask the question as we move forward, is the tourism industry going to be one where the shared economy is going to be is going to play a pivotal role in ensuring that we increase the number of people who have ownership in the hotel industry? Sir, are we going to fully support then disruptive innovations and technologies and social and common sharing platforms like Airbnb and community-driven tourism to ensure that the ownership deadlock that has existed in the tourism industry is broken? As I said, there are two honorable members in here. One is the Minister for Tourism, and I'm sure that she will elaborate on what is happening in the industry. And her colleague as well is usually very versed on the plans. So I move on to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I won't spend much time because the goodly leader of government business made sure to give us a full contribution and description of what is happening in his ministry. And it was also something that was mentioned in the throne speech. So by and large, government is keeping its promises as it relates to supporting new business, as it relates to trade involvement and diplomacy, by establishing these new foreign missions in Ghana, Kenya, United Arab Emirates, and Morocco. So these new missions are costing us $6.6 million this financial year. And in principle, I have no problem, none whatsoever, no problem with these new missions, because Barbados must engage with new markets to expand its trade and investment potential. What concerns me, though, is that we are already signatory to a number of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. And for all intents and purposes, I believe that they're underutilized. And I would be more than happy to be told that I am wrong in this instance, but they're more or less underutilized. Sir, when I looked at our domestic export profile, basically what we sell to the rest of the world, that has not changed in the last 10 to 15 years. And the amount has been relatively stagnant at about $500 million as well. So increasing the number of missions is fine, and the leader of government business spoke about, and I was very happy to hear about commercial diplomacy, digital diplomacy, and all the ways in which we have to now really make sure that these international networks are reflected in the bottom line in terms of our economic growth and development. But sir, we will still have these issues at a localized level where things like the high cost of production, issues related to packaging and labeling, international standards, whether it's things like phytosanitary standards, that we will have to make sure that those types of issues are rectified at scale, Mr. President, to ensure that hand in hand with these new missions, persons who are here on the ground can benefit from the arrangements in these new trade negotiations. Sir, I want to just also quickly touch on culture. And as you would have noticed, Mr. President, I'm going through the ministries that I believe have some economic potential, and they have a role to play in Barbados going forward and increasing our economic footprint, as I sometimes call it. But sir, culture is now, what was the Ministry of Culture is now subsumed in the Prime Minister's office. So it is not necessarily a ministry in and by itself anymore. But more so, I am interested, sir, in the monetization of our arts and culture, because I think that that is another avenue which has the potential for Barbadians to earn foreign exchange. So I was quite surprised that under sub-program 0055 under the Program for Culture in the Prime Minister's Office, the Creative Economy Initiatives were only being allocated $260,000, and that is being allocated for infrastructure building and institutional strengthening. I am not clear as to what that means. Then, sir, we have the National Cultural Foundation being allocated $9.9 million in this upcoming financial year. And I am yet to hear any real plan to transform the National Cultural Foundation to an organization, sir, that pivots us in a new direction to increase economic opportunities for our artists. Because, sir, traditionally, the National Cultural Foundation was one where it was responsible more or less for event planning, such as Crop-Over, and so on, these mass events that Barbados usually has. But so I think it is time that that organization is repurposed. It has to be that our premier institution that is supposed to be supporting arts and culture now has a new mandate that allows for real development of culture industries, as the program statement says. Because I've had the opportunity, Mr. President, in the last few years to be around a few artists. And the way in which they've described their involvement with the National Cultural Foundation, they believe as though the NCF is more interested in preserving its own institutional footprint or existence than it is interested in developing artists. And that is a sad situation. We cannot have an organization which is put in place to support artists being so caught up in their own institutional grandeur, I don't even know what to call it, that you have artists being marginalized because of things like favoritism. That is what I've been told by some artists. So, sir, for me, I think that there needs to be a whole transformation of the National Cultural Foundation. I think it needs re-energizing, I think it needs transformation, and I think it needs a new mandate, because the opportunities for the creative economy, sir, and enhancing the revenue that these artists earn, particularly in the global market space, regionally or globally, sir, is immense potential, and somebody has to have the mandate for that. And right now, the NCF's mandate seems to be waning because, as we know, mass gathering events are not going to happen anytime soon. And I think that this is an opportunity now to look at how we allocate funds to the NCF and what their core mandate is. Because, sir, we have to start asking the question, how do we, in a comprehensive way, support things like graphic design, web development, our musicians? How do we ensure that visual artists, authors, filmmakers can have their products and their services online in a way that supports them financially and is monetized? So that leads me to the Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Smart Technology. Sir, I was actually quite surprised that the ministry is not being allowed more scope. Because I believe that the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology, like the Ministry of Tourism, and how that ministry supports the tourism sector. The Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology should be seen in that way as well. Sir, we have to be able to leverage technology now on a scale that is almost unprecedented nationally to create new businesses. And it is going to be vital, sir, that there is some coherent plan as to how we utilize ICT digitization for all activities in Barbados. And I know that it appears that the ministry's mandate is still very much vested in public sector digitization, which I have no issues with, but I think the scope of the ministry can be expanded significantly to explore areas where government can become entrepreneurial, sir, in nature, and use the allocated expenditure to leapfrog some of our innovators who more or less do not have that supporting facility or organization to do so. And I don't say this because I did not acknowledge some of the things that are listed in the ministry, and I'm querying them so that the honorable member in this chamber can probably give some further explanation and context. But we have a sub-program in the ministry that is sub-program 7157, and it's under General Management and Coordination Services, to $3 million being allocated to Barbados Technical Accelerator Company. Sir, I would like to hear a bit more about that and what that accelerator company is supposed to be doing. Sir, there's also a sub-program 0315, and there's an allocation of $1.2 million, of which $400,000 is earmarked for professional services for a CivTech program, I'd like to hear more about that. And then there's also Shared Services Program 0087, which has an allocated expenditure of $7.5 million, an increase of $2.2 million, which includes the Smart City Wi-Fi project. I've heard some descriptions about that project, but the way in which COVID has made everything now driven by technology, it would be good to hear where we are with that project. So, sir, by and large, I think that these are good signs, and I'm sure I will hear more from the minister responsible for that ministry. And I'm also assuming that there are also financial constraints, as the leader of government business said. Many ministries were asked to see where they can reduce their expenditure. But on top of that, I know I am assuming there's also issues as it relates to the technical capacity within that new ministry. And that further impacting the ability for the ministry to expand. But I think if it is one ministry that is new and know that is more vital than most, because it is now going to underpin all that we do and how we interact, particularly in the global market space, sir, it is the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology. Sir, I move on to the Ministry of Energy and Small Business. And I'll briefly talk about this because I've spoken to the issue of renewables at length in this chamber. But as government promised to take fresh guard, we were told that we were going to have the implementation of some renewable energy projects with the requirement of at least 30% local ownership to all these licenses. Sir, we were told about a project in Vaucluse, St. Thomas, where the project was estimated, the investment was around $360 million, 30 megawatts, a green energy park, I don't live in Vaucluse, sir. I don't know if that project has started, where where the pipeline project is, but $360 million is a good investment that if it has started, it would be good to know what the update is there in that with that green energy part. And sir, in that ministry, there are 2 sub-programs that I want to just highlight. And the 2 of them have an allocation of $17 million. The first one is the Smart Energy Fund, which has $8.5 million allocated to it. And then there is the sub-program for the public sector Smart Energy Program, which is allocated, as I said, $8.4 million. And I know that those initiatives are supported by the IDB. They're supported by the IDB to enhance the work of Barbados moving towards the transition to being fossil fuel free by 2030. And the IDB supports the Energy Division in a lot of work that they do in trying to make this admirable goal a reality. So what I would want to know is where are we in relation to renewable energy generation and capacity? I believe the last set of figures that I was told, I think last year. So where are we as it relates to the capacity, as it relates to renewable energy? And also, it would be interesting for government to take the opportunity now, when they're updating their energy report card, to also indicate where we stand as it relates to the 30% ownership. That can also be a statistic that is reported on that energy report card, because it is one thing to say these things, but sir, so that government is not seen as though they're saying one thing and doing something else, on that energy report card, if we can have some statistic that allows for Barbadians to know if that 30% ownership is actually true, then I think it would be useful. So the other thing that I want to highlight as it relates to that ministry is there's also a project monitoring coordination unit that is being set up to oversee the execution of the BNEP, the Barbados National Energy Policy 2019-2030. And sir, that sub-program is being allocated $630,000 in this upcoming financial year to carry out their mandate. And one of the things that I do know, working with some persons in the renewable energy space and with the Energy Division, is that technical capacity is always an issue. There are just not enough technical experts to carry out the type of work that is needed now, and there's a lot of work to be done, sir, in the implementation of Barbados moving towards renewable energy and electric vehicles. So, sir, I'm just wondering if that $630,000 for that unit will be sufficient to ensure that that unit, because the mandate that they're given as it relates to the Barbados National Energy Policy is wide-ranging. The Barbados National Energy Policy has areas related to things like access to renewable energy, the infrastructure that goes along with it, the financing, how renewables support various industries like manufacturing, tourism, transportation, and the list goes on and on. And I'm just hoping that that coordination unit, in order to be effective, gets the necessary resources, because it will be that overseer of how we progress throughout the Barbados National Energy Policy and the objectives that are outlined in there. Sir, because it is important in the aspect that Barbados becoming fossil fuel free or carbon neutral by 2030, it will set Barbados apart. There's no doubt about that. And it could also be a legacy achievement if it is something that we truly reach in the time frame, in the 9 years that we have. So, sir, in relation to getting there and the aspects as it relates to regulation, the aspects as it relates to infrastructure, sir, I think by and large we have a human resource deficit because the issues are wide-ranging and broad-based. And in order to reach that mandate, we will have to put more resources towards the expertise that is needed for us to get there. So there's also the issue of data as it relates to things like how do we convert private public service vehicles? Where will these vehicles charge? What type of impact will they have on the grid? In terms of the FTC, in terms of the regulatory framework that goes along with charging and vehicle-to-grid services. So there are a number of issues. And there's also a lot of data that is missing to make decisions. So just wanted to flag that, Mr. President, because I think it is an important mandate that we have. I think it has numerous benefits. I also see in the estimates, in the explanatory notes, that we're doing an economic assessment of the energy policy, which is warranted because as good as the goal is, by 2030 being fossil free, there are trade-offs. There will be persons who will be displaced, and we have to see how best we can make sure that we minimize the disruption in the sector. Sir, there's also going to be the implementation of change management and a communication plan for public awareness and outreach. And sir, that is also welcomed because one of the things that has been highlighted in numerous studies as it relates to renewable energy and electric vehicles is the cost and also the knowledge that persons have as it relates to these technologies. And if the ministry can make headways into heightened communication programs and information dissemination to the public of Barbados, so that will go a long way in us moving towards this achievement of being fossil fuel free for 2030. But sir, I want to now step back and give the exercise of this appropriation bill and estimates and revenue and expenditure that goes along with it my own bias. Because, sir, I question everything. Sometimes it's to the annoyance of others, but I view questions as an opportunity for us to open up the possibility space and to think about things differently. Sir, one of the things that I do appreciate is government trying to bring more transparency to the estimates debate. And whether you agree with it or not, it does give those persons in the ministry an opportunity to give context to the numbers, because by and large, this is more or less a financial exercise, but if you don't have the context, then you're still somewhat in the dark in certain areas. So, sir, for me, I think we can go a step further as it relates to this appropriation bill and this exercise of estimates. And sir, what I would propose and put out there is that we move in a direction that is very similar to what is outlined in the Public Finance Management Act 2019, which we're requiring state-owned enterprises to do, where they now must present an annual plan that has commentary on the department's overall performance for the year and a summary of the level of activity undertaken during the year. Sir, I believe that type of reporting accompanying the estimates for many of these ministries and departments should be a natural step for Barbados, because the limited resources that we're dealing with require us, sir, to be laser focused. laser focus on our expenditures and what activities are being done, how the funds are spent, and how they contribute to an overall guiding policy for national development. Sir, at the moment, a lot of persons in Barbados will look at these numbers and they're looking at them in a vacuum and not really truly knowing if ministries are progressing, if they are stagnant, or if the department or ministry is outdated in relation to the needs that they're being asked to serve to Barbadians. Sir, having public servants come to the well in the other place is a helpful exercise. But sir, I think we can go the next natural step, and that is formalizing in documentation the performance of each ministry, accompanied by key indicators, so that Barbadians can see for themselves in a very easy piece of communication how our money is being spent. Sir, it is doable in Montserrat, although it is an overseas territory, and they have certain technical capacity that we don't have, being tied to the UK. But sir, in the opportunity that I had to review Montserrat's estimates recently, their estimates are accompanied line by line with key performance indicators and outcome indicators. Sir, this is the direction I think that we should be moving in, so that we know when monies are allocated, that the requisite indicators, whether it be in tourism, culture, foreign affairs, agriculture, we can also have an opportunity also to evaluate the ministries and actually ask the question and have an answer if we are achieving the goals that is intended. Sir, at the moment, the estimates of revenue and expenditure are just a proposition. They don't have an evaluative aspect to them. And sir, I think given the situation we find ourselves in with extremely limited financial resources, this should be a natural progression. So sir, if it is anything that is remembered here today, I hope that that final comment that I've made in relation to ensuring that we move to a position where we can evaluate ministries. We know what are the key indicators, what are the key measures by which the ministry is putting in place to make sure that the work that is being done in the ministry is achieved. I think that that is something that can accompany these estimates, because it is important. Yes, we know that members of the cabinet can come and give some type of update, but formal documentation, I believe, sir, is something that we can do, we should do, and it would be in a good governance arrangement with the people of Barbados to know how their money is being spent and what the money is being spent on, and how is the ministry, our department, performing in the future. So, sir, I will end there, and I thank you for your indulgence, and I hope that some of the questions that I would have raised in terms of some of the sub-programs, there is some information that can be given so that the people of Barbados can know what some of these numbers mean and how our money is being spent to ensure that Barbados is moving forward in a position that we have economic growth in the near future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Drakes. Senator Walcott.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this sitting be now suspended until 3 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 3 p.m. today. Those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Sitting is now suspended.